June 6, 1944. The hour of history. The largest coordinated invasion the world had ever conceived was tearing through the Atlantic Wall. Yet the entire German High Command was paralyzed by a single, terrifying silence. Adolf Hitler slept. As the pre-dawn darkness gave way to the firestorm of Normandy, the most crucial countermeasures remained locked down. His generals, receiving confirmation of the devastating Allied landings, dared not awaken the Führer. They understood his tempestuous, destructive nature. They knew the penalty for delivering catastrophic news prematurely. Every moment Hitler remained in his oblivious slumber. The fate of the Reich was irrevocably decided on the beaches. Hours, precious, bloody hours, vanished. While landing craft carrying soldiers, like Lieutenant Hartmann and his soon-to-be tank crew, breached the surf, while thousands of Americans, British, and Canadians clawed their way onto the sand, Germany's armored reserve stood motionless, awaiting a single man's irrational command. When the Führer finally awoke and was confronted with the brutal reality, his response was not panic, but chilling, fatal hubris. He uttered words that revealed the monumental scope of his blindness, dismissing the invasion as a mere feint. It was the single, most disastrous decision of the entire war, a blunder so unforgivable it would forever haunt the shattered remnants of his officer corps. That morning, everything changed. The rising sun revealed a seascape choked with invasion ships. D-Day. Boats packed with troops crashed through the waves, churning the channel into a terrifying froth. The roar of Allied planes drowned out the cries of men. On the beaches, German defenses were instantly overwhelmed, desperately trying to hold back the relentless human tide. But the attack was constant, wave after agonizing wave. The invasion was inland, and it had been given the time it needed to take root, deep within the bunkers of the Reich. The phone lines were screaming. The massive gamble, the German counterattack known as Operation Luttich, was already underway, throwing the American advance into chaos near Mortain, aiming desperately for the strategic choke point of Avranches. Frantic reports of success, failure, and utter confusion flooded the situation rooms. The fate of the entire Western Front was being decided on French soil, moment by agonizing moment. But here at the epicenter of German power, there was a profound, suffocating silence. The man upon whose whim the destiny of Europe rested was profoundly, utterly unaware. Adolf Hitler was fast asleep. Generals and staff officers stood immobilized in the hushed, subterranean hallways. They moved like ghosts, their boots silent on the carpeted floor. They exchanged terrified whispers, all eyes locked on a single, unassuming bedroom door. Critical decisions, the commitment of Panzer reserves, the coordination of air support, were being delayed. Yet the paralysis of fear held the entire command structure captive. Hitler's routine was infamous, often staying awake until 4 or 5 a.m., consumed by rambling monologues, sometimes strategic, often just tedious lectures on Renaissance art or architectural plans. He would then sleep until the late afternoon. His staff knew the unwritten law: never disturb the Führer's rest. Hitler's legendary temper wasn't just a threat, it was a weapon. Officers had been publicly humiliated for lesser infractions. Careers had been instantly vaporized. Worse consequences, even facing a summary court-martial, awaited those who jeopardized the schedule. So on this pivotal morning, as the most critical counteroffensive of the summer raged, the men tasked with saving the Reich stood frozen, paralyzed by the fear of waking a sleeping dictator. Reports detailing the greatest amphibious assault in history slammed against the walls of the Führer bunker. Yet, amid the seismic shock of D-Day, one man slept. His inner circle, paralyzed by a familiar fear, faced an impossible calculation. To rouse him was to risk a catastrophic, sputtering rage, potentially leading to a swift court-martial. To wait was to hemorrhage the precious hours Germany needed to repel the invasion. They chose silence. They chose delay. And as the Allied tide washed relentlessly across the sands of Normandy, securing the first crucial beachheads and moving decisively inland, Adolf Hitler lay in profound, oblivious slumber. The ticking clock of history was running out of precious sand, and Germany could not buy it back. When the dictator finally stirred, approaching high noon, hours after the first American boot hit French soil, the atmosphere was electric. His staff rushed him, maps spread out like gruesome prophecies. They pointed to the coastline. They pleaded with the sheer weight of the evidence. Thousands of enemy troops, an endless armada covering the horizon. Hitler listened. His face, usually flushed with maniacal energy, was cold. And then he delivered the sentence that would seal the fate of the Western Front, a delusion so profound it stunned every general in the room. He dismissed the entire invasion. He called the massive assault a mere feint, a calculated trick. He was utterly convinced the true blow, the definitive, world-ending attack, would come further north at Calais. Normandy, he insisted, was a magnificent fraud, a diversion designed solely to draw German panzer divisions away from the critical northern defenses. His most seasoned generals strained to counter the fantasy, attempting to puncture the delusion with hard facts. This was no diversion. This was the invasion. This wasn't just a military miscalculation. It was a profound act of strategic suicide, fueled entirely by the Führer's iron will and catastrophic ego. Adolf Hitler had convinced himself, months before the first boot touched the sand, that the Normandy landings were nothing more than a feint. His focus remained fixed, pathologically, on the heavily fortified coastline of Calais. He had poured his elite strength, his finest panzer divisions, tanks desperately needed elsewhere, into defending this phantom front. "Let them come," he reportedly snarled, dismissing his general staff's growing terror. "We shall crush them at Calais." But the invasion at Calais never arrived. It was a ghost, a magnificent deception masterfully executed by the Allied command. And while Hitler waited for specters, the real battle raged. German soldiers bled out in the Normandy hedgerows, fighting a desperate, losing battle against overwhelming force. Their lifeline? Armor. They needed tanks, specifically the elite heavy metal idling hundreds of miles away. Germany possessed the power to shatter the beachhead. Elite panzer divisions, veteran armored units that could have driven the Allied forces straight back into the Channel, were stationed within striking distance. But these divisions were shackled. They were Hitler's personal reserve, and only he could authorize their deployment. For agonizing hours, field commanders pounded their radios, their voices hoarse with mounting desperation. "Asterisk send the panzers. The line is breaking. We need reinforcements. Asterisk." The response from the bunker, delivered through layers of furious denial and obsession, was always the same chilling decree. Wait. Reinforcements are unnecessary. The real invasion is still coming at Calais. That strategic paralysis, that refusal to accept reality, has been marked by military historians as one of the single most catastrophic decisions of the entire war. This delay will become enshrined in the history books as one of the most catastrophic strategic failures of the entire war. 12 precious hours, a lifetime in the crucible of battle, were simply incinerated by Hitler's fatal indecision. By the time the Führer finally released the armored fist of the panzers for Operation Leiterschleit that afternoon, the ground had hardened into an impenetrable fortress. The Allies, utilizing every stolen minute, had dragged deadly anti-tank guns into position, digging in along the crucial approaches to Avranches. More critically, the skies above Mortain were no longer neutral territory. When the massive German columns finally rolled forward, anticipating a blitzkrieg breakthrough, they were met not by chaos, but by merciless, structured annihilation. Allied air power, circling like hungry hawks, savaged the armored thrust. The panzers, stripped of cover and surprise, were exposed silhouettes against the Normandy fields, destroyed one by one in plumes of black smoke and twisted metal. What was meant to be a devastating German counterattack devolved instantly into a desperate, bloody defense. The entire pivot point of the campaign came down to one man's fatal obsession: why Hitler had miscalculated so completely. He was fixated on a phantom. The Allies had executed a deception campaign of unprecedented genius. Operation Fortitude. They created ghost armies, hundreds of rubber tanks, dummy landing craft, and coordinated false radio transmissions, all staged far north of the real fighting. The psychological trap was set by the man commanding this fictitious force, General George Marx. The German High Command knew Marx. They feared him, and when the intelligence confirmed he was poised to strike, Hitler froze, convinced the real battle was still to come, diverting critical reserves away from the hell brewing around Mortain. He had been played perfectly. He was their most feared opponent. A shadow army, a host of tanks and divisions that existed only on paper. Allied ingenuity had spun the grandest lie of the war, a veil of deceit so complete it paralyzed the German high command. Hitler's intelligence officers were drowning in noise. Spies reported seeing massive ghost forces. Radio channels hummed with fake operational chatter, and intercepted signals spoke relentlessly of a coming blow aimed solely at the Pas-de-Calais. Every photograph, every whispered rumor, every intercepted message pointed to Calais, and Hitler believed it completely. This is the hinge upon which the war turned. The Führer did not just accept the deception. He internalized it, convinced so thoroughly that no amount of counter-evidence could breach his conviction. He had won through bold gambits before, but on this day, that iron stubbornness became the fatal crack in the foundation of the Third Reich. Even when his most trusted officers brought him undeniable proof of the gathering storm in the West, he dismissed it with paranoid fury. This is precisely the illusion they wish us to chase, he insisted. He trusted the toxic certainty of his intuition over the brutal reality presented by his military intelligence. The man who demanded absolute, monolithic control made an absolutely catastrophic strategic mistake. The generals knew better. Hitler's senior military commanders watched in horror as the trap was sprung. Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox, had inspected the Normandy beaches months earlier, his strategic senses honed by years of combat. He foresaw the true danger and delivered his ignored prophecy. He warned Hitler, if they come, they'll come. The field marshals, boots deep in the Normandy mud, weren't asking politely. They were begging, frantic, detailed appeals demanding more panzers, more defensive layers, more men entrenched along the threatened coastline. They knew precisely where the Allied hammer would fall. But Adolf Hitler was deaf to expertise. Field Marshal Rommel was soundly overruled. Resources crucial for the Atlantic Wall were instead siphoned off, moved inland to satisfy Hitler's paranoid theories about where the real invasion would strike. Then came the morning of June 6, 1944. In a fatal blunder that would define the opening hours of the battle, Rommel wasn't even at his command post. He had traveled deep into Germany for his wife's birthday. When the thunder of the invasion finally shattered the morning calm, he raced back immediately, but the crucial hours, the window of decisive counter-response, had already slammed shut. The damage was catastrophic. This catastrophic inaction was systemic. Throughout the chain of command, brilliant German generals saw the truth, made the correct, textbook calls, and watched helplessly as their sound judgment was dismissed. In Nazi Germany, the iron fist of military decision-making was clenched by a single man. Hitler had centralized all strategic power, trusting no one, demanding absolute fealty to his often deranged theories. This wasn't just about D-Day. For years, Hitler had been summarily overriding his experts, sometimes succeeding, but far more often condemning his forces to defeat. A disastrous pattern that would repeat itself later in battles like the massive counterthrust of Operation Luttich near Mortain, aimed desperately at Avranches. On June 6, 1944, Hitler's obsessive need for total control backfired completely. While the Führer slept the vital pre-dawn hours, then stubbornly clung to his disastrous theories of maneuver, the war, and the entire future of the Third Reich, slipped irrevocably away. History was being written on those beaches, and the pen was held by Allied hands. The beaches were soaked in blood, but the Allied line held. By the time the terrible tide of battle receded, over 150,000 soldiers had clawed their way ashore, a terrible price paid in the surf and the sand for the precious foothold. But that foothold was secure. The window of opportunity had slammed shut. The one fleeting chance the Wehrmacht had to push the invasion back into the churning ocean was squandered by the paralyzing confusion and catastrophic indecision emanating from the Führer's bunker. Hitler's delayed, maddeningly fragmented response cost Germany its last hope. Within weeks, Normandy transformed into a sprawling logistical juggernaut. The Allies poured colossal supply lines onto the continent. Every day brought more steel, more thunder. Tanks, artillery, and endless streams of infantry arrived. Among them was a crew of the tank Reckless, Lieutenant Carl Hartmann, commanding the hull, with Gunner Earl Bishop and Loader James Ortega in the turret, and Tony Vitelli gripping the controls as driver. The dam had broken. Liberation had begun, a relentless torrent sweeping across France. For Hitler, D-Day was not a setback. It was the epitaph of his 1,000-year Reich. The war in the West was, in all practical terms, over. Only the agonizing countdown remained. His generals knew it. They saw the catastrophe that Hitler's leadership had wrought, leading some, like George Marx, to whisper of revolution and assassination. Yet, even as the walls of his empire crumbled, Hitler refused to sign the ER that declared him wrong about D-Day. He raged, consumed by paranoia, blaming his weary commanders, setting the stage for one final, desperate gamble. Operation Luttich, a furious, suicidal counterattack aimed squarely at the Allied flank near Mortain, hoping to punch through to the strategic prize of Avranches. The Fuhrer raged, a broken man trapped within his collapsing fantasy. He searched frantically for traitors, blaming the high command, the supply lines, the weak wills of the field marshals. He blamed everyone except the reflection staring back from a map room glass. The architect who had staked his entire mythology on infallible strategic genius would not admit the truth. He had failed, catastrophically, and the genesis of that annihilation always circled back to one pivotal dawn, the moment he slept through the alarm, the moment he awoke, refusing the counsel of every panicked general pleading for action. The words he spoke that sealed Germany's fate were not shouted in fury, but delivered in chilling, dismissive calm. What did Hitler say that morning, when the destiny of the Western Front hung on his decision, when the relentless Allied tide was already surging toward crucial objectives like Avranches? Witnesses described not panic, but contemptuous arrogance. He brushed off the urgency. "So they've come," he reportedly stated, as if dismissing a minor border skirmish that posed no threat to the impending Operation Luttich. Then came the 6 fatal words that defined the day, the failure, and the horrifying cost soon to be paid by men like Lieutenant Karl Hartmann during the ensuing battles at Mortain. This is not the real invasion. In those 6 words lay the complete, fatal flaw of Hitler's leadership, his unshakable hubris, his stubborn refusal to accept reality, even when the Allied assault was literally securing the beachhead. He had so thoroughly convinced himself of his own strategic brilliance that he mistook the death blow for a feint. By the time his shattered ego allowed him to change his mind, by the time he authorized the army reserves that might have saved the line, the window had slammed shut. The opportunity to push the Allies back was gone forever. Military historians still dissect this pivotal moment, marking it as the true point of no return. This is a legend of failure, a case study taught in war colleges on how absolute command, fueled by absolute hubris, can cripple an empire. One man's catastrophic misjudgment, one single morning of paralysis, and the trajectory of World War II snapped forever. The beaches of Normandy, meant to be the Allies' watery grave, instead became the decisive, bloody grave marker for Nazi Germany. And it all hinged upon a profound historical silence. While the largest amphibious invasion in history thundered onto Fortress Europe, while the Atlantic Wall cracked and splintered under the weight of Allied steel, the Fuhrer slept. He was entombed in his lair, insulated by layers of fear and protocol. Subordinates, terrified of his notorious temper, dared not disturb his rest. Even as world history turned outside his window, when the truth finally pierced his insulated reality, Hitler's response wasn't mobilization. It was poisonous, fatal arrogance. He clung to the delusion of a phantom invasion elsewhere. He dismissed the reports of American, British, and Canadian forces as a cynical feint, believing the true landing was yet to come. The news is impossible. Those were the words that echoed through the Chancellery, a denial so profound it metastasized into military policy. Hitler's entire command structure seized up, paralyzed by his disbelief. The tanks that could have driven the invaders back into the sea were held in reserve, waiting for an attack that would never materialize. His orders, when they finally arrived, were hours too late, based on illusion. There was no D-Day speech rallying the troops, no thunderous command to repel the tide. Just silence, sleep, stubbornness, and the single, catastrophic mistake that bought the Allies the crucial time they needed to secure the foothold of liberation. Music,